Okay, so I left the other sketch, which didn't live trace too well, and I go back to my composite within Photoshop. And now, if I can work on this to get this to be really clean, even though it's not high res, this is very clean, then I can bring that into Illustrator and it will create accurate vectors for me, right? So the only thing that's not accurate and clean is my sketch part. So what can I do to make really clean shapes? Well, I'm probably not going to use the brush tool, or clone stamp or smudge or a lot of the tools we've used, but the one tool that we've used and one exercise we had was the shape composition. And so if we go to the vector tools in Illustrator, especially the shapes, you can see how I can make these kind of shapes work. So I can work with the ellipse tool, for instance, and I can make an oval, and I can fill it with black by double clicking and picking a color, right? And then I can transform it. I can warp it. And this is very much like how Illustrator works. Except you're going to be manipulating individual anchor points. And not a mesh warp screen. But the benefit of using the shape tool is everything is kind of smooth and contained, right? It's hard to make it fussy. And that's why we did that shape exercise. So that might be one. I can duplicate that, or I can just make another shape underneath. That I warp. And stretch. And I don't need to get everything right here in Photoshop, because notice everything is still rasterized and pixelated. And it's okay, even though it doesn't matter if I would put this at a really high resolution or not. In fact, it might even be worse to put it at a high resolution because I have those composited logos. I don't want to soften them out. But now if I turn off my sketch, yeah, now that little leaf grouping, that looks cleaner. But maybe it's not the best it can be, but that's something I can work with in Illustrator once I have it in there. Okay, so other shape tools. I might take the rounded, I haven't used this much, but it's fun, the rounded rectangle tool, make a straight line, right? What I like about the rounded rectangle tool is you can actually change here in properties how rounded it is. So mine's 10 pixels rounded, that's pretty big for this resolution. But what I'm most interested in doing is warping it. Sending out a curve on this side, getting that curve to kind of work into the existing curve here, but also not overlapping with the edge of this shape. So I'm deviating from my sketch a little bit. And you can see this is quite difficult to do without vector tools, tracing that curve cleanly into another curve, but we'll be able to fix it. Say again? No, so this is legitimate, because so the question was, can this be the way we make our vector? And yes, as long as you actually make a vector. So you can make it as clean as you can in Photoshop, then live trace it, and it will be a vector. But then I also want you to know how to clean it up after it's been live traced. Because even the best design that you bring in might be able to be improved. But I personally like to always go into Illustrator with something. That tends to work out better for me than just creating something from scratch within Illustrator. So these are a few different ways to do that. All right. And I'm actually going to stretch this out into being kind of the stem for this BP flower at the top. Okay, so let's see how that looks. If I turn off my sketch, turn off the guide, click on a different layer. So there are some issues with it. I want that curve to be gentle and perfect, and it's not yet. And it would be hard to get it that way in Photoshop with the shape tools. I could use the pen tool, and there are ways to do it, but you might as well do those in Illustrator. But I'm liking that so far. Now I need another curve for this other part. And it's going to branch off. So I'm going to do the same thing, use the rounded rectangle. Fill it with black. It has no stroke on it. Transform it, warp it, curve it in. Yeah, so logo design, it's a design issue. It's all about problem solving. So I'm trying to show you multiple ways you can make it work with what you're excited about for making art. So this is doing a lot of it in Photoshop, but it's using the vector tools within Photoshop. And that's going to be a little too thick. But instead of trying to fix that necessarily with the warp tool, though I think I can do a fair amount with it. Yeah, it's looking better. I can fix that in Illustrator as well. Okay, so let's see how that looks. Looks okay. Got a little funky at the top, but that can be fixed in Illustrator. And then at the bottom it has this little tail. So that's no good. So what I can do, I don't need to keep these as shape tools. I can rasterize it, just turn it into pixels. But luckily they're on different layers, right? And I can just cut it off. Okay, so far so good. What else do I need? I want as few other leaves as possible. In fact, with that stem, I think I want to move these down. So I'm going to select these two layers. Hold down Shift so they're both selected and move them a little bit. And I'm going to simply merge them, Command E, and then duplicate them. And then this is something very common in logo design. Whoops. Rotate them, holding down Shift so it's really accurate. Hold down Shift so it doesn't distort. So I'm going to use the exact same over here. This is a way of getting kind of visual balance and repetition. You don't have to redraw everything. I might turn this a little bit more. Maybe even making it a little bit closer because you're playing with, you want to be mindful of the negative space as well, like how much space is in between, and it kind of feels like that picks up. Yeah, so that's working. Now I just need something here. So I'll do it with the ellipse tool, and then I'll be able to bring it into Illustrator. So this is all shaping up pretty quickly because I'm already familiar, and you should be familiar with the shape tools within Photoshop. And notice I'm not using the tablet and the stylus at all for this. I'm pretty much doing it all with the mouse. And this type of manipulation, both in Photoshop and in Illustrator, this kind of point manipulation, or in Illustrator an anchor manipulation, this is all most easily done with a mouse. Because it's all about very particular selections, like clicking here and pushing in. So the reason we did that exercise early in the semester was to kind of trick you into doing a little bit of Illustrator technique so it doesn't scare you so much. All right, that looks pretty good. Let me shrink it a little bit. Now, even using the shape tools and warping, it's still a little funky looking. And I can stretch it out. But this can be nice to do in Photoshop instead of Illustrator because it's something you're already familiar with and it feels a little bit more intuitive. Yeah, that might be all I need. I don't know if I actually need this other little sprig here. I think that's going to be distracting. So, let's say I like that design. I save it within Photoshop. I turn it off. I think I want to move this in a little closer. And because they're all just basically raster images, I can mess with that until I'm happy with it. And again, I'm looking not just at the black forms, but the shapes in between them. Okay. Now that's guided by my sketch, but it's definitely more cleaned up, more tightened. And this would be something I can bring into Illustrator and Live Trace because it's all very even though it's not very big. So how do I save it? File, Save As. I'm going to save this as a PNG to the desktop. I have the background sketch turned off. And I usually call these test files. I just put my name in that. Because their only point is to be transitional. So I'll save my PSD, where I made this, but this PNG that I'm saving out to the desktop, I save it with my name and as a test file. Because when I bring it into, I'm testing to see if Illustrator will trace it well. Okay, so let's close that. I don't need it anymore. And save it as a PSD. And now I shouldn't need Photoshop again. Okay, so now I go to Illustrator and I'm going to open up this PNG. I can also just take the PNG and drag it down to the Illustrator icon. And it will open up as a new file. Right? I can use the large selection tool. And because it brought in a PNG, notice there's no white around it. And I can shrink it to fit on what's called the artboard here. Why does it need to fit on the artboard? It doesn't, but it makes it a little bit easier to see. And all the artboard does is show you what it would print at if you printed out of Illustrator. Like this is a letter page size piece of paper. And I can actually turn on rulers, Command R, to see that. My rulers are measured in points right now and not inches, but we don't use the rulers much in Illustrator because vectors can be scaled to any size. All right, so now I have it placed, but it's a raster file, right? But it's a much cleaner one than my sketchbook, but there are little inconsistencies. So now how do I live trace it? Well, I just click on it with the large selection tool. I say Image Trace, drop down, black and white logo. Just like I tried with my sketch. Notice how it filled everything in with white. So I go to my image trace options. To get that, you click here. And I go to Advanced, and I click on Ignore White. And then the white will go away. And now I can zoom in, and I can set these settings. So it's interesting. At these settings, which I used before, because it will remember, it kind of softened some corners. So I want it to have all the corners. So if I say more corners, now they're not soft anymore. So these settings matter. Soft, not soft. And basically I want it to match as closely as it can what I brought into it. So how many paths do I want? I want as many as possible. But no, that's a little too crazy. So I need to find where was it cleanest. And that looks pretty clean. Maybe a little bit more, because I want that symmetry. That looks pretty good. Let's try 175. Looks pretty good. I think I can push it pretty far.